You've probably seen the picture. It's in museums, in textbooks, in movies. A man, strong and hairy, stands over a dead mammoth, holding a spear. In the background, near a cave, a woman tends a fire or carries a basket full of berries. He is the hunter. She is the gatherer. This image is powerful. It feels ancient and true. It seems to explain so much about men and women today. For a long time, this was the accepted story of our ancestors. The story was called Man the Hunter, and it was a very influential idea. It said that hunting big animals is what made us human. It forced us to develop tools to cooperate, to plan, and to create language. The hunt was the engine of human evolution, and men were the ones doing the driving. In this story, women played a supporting role. They were tied to the home base, the camp. They were either pregnant or nursing or looking after small children. Their main job was to gather plants. Roots, nuts, berries. It was seen as a safe, steady, but ultimately less important job. It didn't have the glamour or the evolutionary force of the hunt. Gathering provided the daily calories, sure. But hunting provided the protein, the prestige, and the push towards progress. This picture of the past shaped how we saw the present. If men were naturally hunters, it made sense that they were more aggressive, more competitive, more suited for public life. If women were naturally gatherers and caregivers, it made sense that they were more nurturing, more domestic, more suited for the private sphere. The story of the caveman justified the world of the 1950s and 60s. It felt like destiny, written in our genes. But what if that picture is wrong? Not just a little bit wrong, but fundamentally wrong. What if the story is much more complex, more interesting, and more flexible than we ever thought? Over the last few decades, new discoveries and a fresh look at old evidence have started to tell a different story. A story where women weren't just gathering, a story where women hunted too. Let's start with the classic story and understand why it was so convincing. The man the hunter model really took off in the 1960s. Anthropologists held a big conference and published a book with that title. It was a powerful framework. The evidence seemed to support it. Archaeologists found ancient campsites littered with the bones of huge animals like mammoths and giant bison. Next to those bones, they found stone spear points and butchering tools. It was easy to connect the dots. Men made these tools to hunt these animals. They also looked at skeletons. They found male skeletons from the Stone Age with injuries that looked a lot like what you'd get from a rodeo rider. Healed fractures, crushed bones. These were the marks of a dangerous life, a life spent wrestling with big, angry animals. It was a story of male courage and risk-taking, and this story made hunting the central drama of human existence. To hunt a mammoth, you couldn't just run at it with a pointy stick. You needed a plan. You needed to communicate with your fellow hunters. You needed to know the animal's behavior and the lay of the land. You had to work together, maybe for days, tracking the beast. This need for cooperation, the theory went, drove the expansion of our brains. Our language evolved, so we could say, you circle around from the left, I'll throw the spear when it turns. Hunting also explained the family structure. A man would hunt and bring meat back to his mate and their children. This meat was a valuable high-energy food source. It helped feed those growing brains. The woman, in return for this provision, remained faithful to the hunter. This created the nuclear family, or at least its ancient prototype. It all fit together neatly. Men hunt, women raise children, society is born. But even as this story was being told, some people, mostly female researchers, started to question it. They asked a simple question: what about the gathering? Was it really just a side job, a way to get some salad to go with the mammoth steak? They argued that this was a huge oversight, born from a modern bias that valued male work over female work. When they started to look at modern hunter-gatherer societies, the kind of groups that live a lifestyle closer to our ancestors, they found something surprising. In most of these groups, the food women gathered made up the majority of the diet. Sometimes as much as 70 or 80% of the calories came from plants, nuts, and small animals gathered by women. So hunting was often a boom-and-bust activity. A hunter might go out for days and come back with nothing. The hunt was glorious, but it was unreliable. Gathering, on the other hand, was steady. You almost always came back with something. The yams and roots that women dug up were the food that kept the group from starving between successful hunts. Gathering was the economic bedrock of the society, and it wasn't easy work. It required an incredible amount of knowledge. A gatherer had to be a walking encyclopedia of botany. She needed to know hundreds of different plants. She had to know which ones were edible, which ones were poisonous, and which ones could be made edible through complex processing like soaking or cooking. She had to know where to find them and at what time of year. She needed a mental map of the entire territory, tracking the seasonal cycles of countless different species. This was a science, passed down from mother to daughter for generations, so a new model emerged. It was sometimes called Woman the Gatherer. It didn't erase the male hunter, but it put the female gatherer at the center of the story. It argued that the consistent, reliable food provided by women was just as important, if not more so, for our survival and evolution. It emphasized the mother-child bond as the core of human society, with men more on the periphery. This was a vital correction. It brought women back into the story as active, essential economic players. But it still kept men and women in separate boxes. Men did one thing, women did another. The idea of a strict division of labor remained. The picture was now more balanced, but it was still a picture of two different worlds. One male, one female. The question lingered, was the line between these worlds really so sharp? Then, in 2018, something happened that blew a hole in that line. Archaeologists were digging at a high-altitude site in the Andes Mountains of Peru called Willamaya Pachixa. They found a 9,000-year-old burial. The person was buried with a very impressive toolkit. There were stone points for spears or darts, tools for scraping hides, and heavy stones for breaking bones. It was a big game hunter's kit, the kind of burial that gets archaeologists excited. Based on everything they knew, the lead archaeologist assumed the skeleton belonged to a man. A great hunter, maybe a chief, it made perfect sense. An osteologist, a scientist who studies bones, looked at the skeleton. The bones were slender and light. The osteologist suggested it might be a female. The team was skeptical. The idea was so contrary to the established model, so they did a DNA test. They analyzed the protein in the tooth enamel. The results were clear and undeniable. The great hunter was a woman, a young woman, probably between 17 and 19 years old. This was a shock. Was she just a weird one-off, a single exception to the rule? The research team wondered how many other great hunters, buried with their tools, had been wrongly identified as male just because of their grave goods. So they launched a massive review of the scientific literature. They looked at all the late Pleistocene and early Holocene burials across North and South America. They focused on individuals buried with big game hunting tools. They found 27 individuals who fit the criteria. Of those, 11 were female, 16 were male. This wasn't a single exception, it was a pattern. Nearly half of the hunters in their sample were women. The conclusion was startling. In the Americas, around 10,000 years ago, big game hunting was not an exclusively male activity. Women were hunters. This discovery opened the floodgates. Scientists started looking for other evidence, and they found it. They looked again at modern hunter-gatherer groups. It turns out we had evidence of female hunters all along, but we'd often dismissed it as unusual or unimportant. Take the Agda people of the Philippines. Agda women are incredible hunters. They hunt deer and wild pigs. They hunt with knives, spears, and bows and arrows. They often hunt in groups with dogs. Studies have shown they are just as efficient as the men and sometimes even more successful. They don't stop hunting when they have children. They often carry their infants with them on hunts. It's just a normal part of their lives. Or look at the Ayata, another group from the Philippines. Women participate in up to 85% of the hunts. The Martu of Australia use fire to flush out lizards and other small game, an activity where men and women work together. In many societies, the lines are blurry. People do what needs to be done. It also became clear that hunting isn't just one thing. We tend to imagine a group of men chasing a mammoth, but that's just one type of hunting. A lot of hunting involves traps, snares, and nets. These methods are incredibly effective and don't necessarily require the same kind of upper body strength as throwing a heavy spear. For example, many groups use large nets to catch animals. The Mbuti people of Central Africa do this. The entire community participates. Men, women, and children spread out in a large semicircle holding the nets. Others make noise to drive animals into the nets. It's a cooperative, communal effort. Everyone is a hunter. There is no rigid division of labor here. It's all hands on deck. This new evidence forces us to reconsider the old biological arguments. The classic story said that men hunted because they were bigger and stronger, on average. And it's true that human males tend to have more upper body muscle mass than females. This would be an advantage for throwing a spear or wrestling an animal, but hunting is not just about brute strength. Much of it is about endurance. Persistence hunting, where you track and chase an animal until it collapses from exhaustion, was likely a very early human hunting strategy. And it turns out women might have an advantage here. The hormone estrogen helps regulate fat metabolism and aids muscle endurance. Some studies suggest that women's bodies are better built for long-duration endurance activities than for short bursts of power. The idea that female physiology is unsuited for hunting is simply not true. It might just be suited for a different style of hunting. What about the biggest argument of all? The constraint of children. The old model said that women were tied to the camp because they were always either pregnant or breastfeeding a dependent child. This seems like a powerful constraint. It's hard to chase a deer with a baby on your hip. But this argument assumes that each mother raised her children in isolation. This is a very modern Western idea. In hunter-gatherer societies, childcare is almost never a solo job. It's a community effort. This is called alloparenting, which means other parenting. Grandmothers, aunts, uncles, older siblings, and fathers all play a role in raising children. A mother with a young infant could leave the child in the care of her own mother or a sister while she went out to hunt or gather. The role of grandmothers is especially important. The grandmother hypothesis suggests that one of the keys to human success is that women live long past their reproductive years. These post-menopausal women, free from the demands of their own infants, could help their daughters raise children. This support freed up the younger women to have more babies and to contribute more food to the group. A grandmother's help could make the difference between starvation and survival. So, the burden of childcare wasn't necessarily a barrier that kept all women in camp all the time. Human society has always been flexible and cooperative. We survived because we helped each other. With all this new information, we have to look back at the archaeological record with new eyes. When we find a skeleton buried with a spear point, we can no longer just assume it's a man. We have to test it. When we look at cave paintings of hunting scenes, we can no longer assume they were painted by men. In many of the famous painted caves in France and Spain, the handprints left on the walls are female. We don't know for sure what that means. Were they the artists, the shamans? Well, we can't say. But we can say that women were there in those sacred spaces. The tools themselves also tell a more complicated story. For a long time, archaeologists assumed that the big, impressive stone points were made by men for hunting, and the smaller, less glamorous scrapers and grinding stones were made by women for processing plants and hides. This was just an assumption, based on our own stereotypes. There's no reason why a woman couldn't be a skilled flint knapper, an expert toolmaker. And there's no reason a man couldn't process a hide or grind some nuts. The idea that we had his and hers toolkits in the Stone Age is probably a fantasy. Most people likely knew how to make and use a variety of tools depending on the task at hand. So, if the evidence for female hunters and flexible gender roles is so strong, why did the man-the-hunter story stick around for so long? Why was it so powerful? Part of the reason is simple bias. The field of anthropology was dominated by men for most of the 20th century. They looked at the past and saw a reflection of their own world. In their world, men went to work and women stayed home. They projected this model onto our ancestors. They saw male action as the driver of history, and they built a story around it. It's a phenomenon called presentism, where we interpret the past through the lens of the present. The story was also just a good story. It was dramatic and heroic. The image of the brave hunter risking his life to feed his family is compelling. It's a story of struggle and triumph. It's much more exciting than a story about a group of women methodically digging for roots for 8 hours. We are drawn to narratives of heroic individuals, and Men the Hunter provided that. And whether intentionally or not, the story did political work. It served to naturalize the gender roles of the time. If the division of labor we saw in the 20th century was rooted in millions of years of evolution, then it must be the natural order of things. It wasn't a product of culture or history, but of biology. This made challenging those gender roles seem like fighting against nature itself. The story of our past was used to justify the inequalities of the present. So where does that leave us? Did men hunt while women gathered? The answer is not a simple yes or no. The real answer is much more satisfying. It depends. It depends on the place, the time period, the specific culture, the available food, and the individual person. Humanity's greatest asset has never been brute strength, or a rigid set of rules. It has always been our incredible flexibility, our adaptability. We survived ice ages and massive climate shifts because we were able to change our behavior to fit the circumstances. In some places, it might have made sense for men to do most of the big game hunting. In other places, it might have been an activity for everyone. In still others, women may have been the primary hunters of certain types of game. A person's role in the group was likely not fixed for life. A young woman might be a formidable hunter. After having a child, she might spend a few years focusing more on gathering and childcare, staying closer to camp. As her children grew older, she might return to hunting, or she might become a respected elder, a keeper of knowledge, a healer, or a spiritual leader. People's lives were dynamic. They changed. The real story of our ancestors is not one of rigid division, but of collaboration. The hunt for a large animal might have been led by a few strong individuals, but its success depended on the entire community. The people who made the tools, the people who knew where to find the animals, the people who processed the meat and hide, and the people who took care of the children while the hunters were away, all of them were essential. The calories from the gathered plants fed the hunters and gave them the energy to go out in the first place. Human society worked because it was a team effort. Everyone had a vital role to play, and those roles were often fluid and interchangeable. The key to our evolution wasn't a male hunter dragging a carcass home to his passive mate. The key was a cooperative group of intelligent, adaptable people, men and women, young and old, working together to solve the problems of survival. The old picture of the caveman and the cavewoman is finally starting to fade. In its place, a much richer, more accurate, and more human picture is emerging. It's a picture of a world where women were not just passive objects of evolution waiting for men to bring home the bacon. They were active agents in their own survival. They were innovators, scientists, artists, and leaders. And yes, they were hunters. Knowing this changes how we see our past, and it can change how we see ourselves. It tells us that there is no single natural way for men and women to be. Our history is not one of rigid, biologically determined roles. It is a history of immense diversity and flexibility. That is our true evolutionary inheritance. We are the descendants of people who survived because they were smart enough not to get trapped in a single story.